What image comes to our mind when we think of the word scientist or researcher? It could be a scientist or researcher from any field: biology, sociology, psychology, software technology. But what image do we conjure up? Probably that of a dowdy, dreary, serious-looking man or woman, young or old, it doesn't matter. But the demeanor will be rigid and official. Maybe wearing glasses with a bit of forced humor, most definitely wearing something bland, pastel-shaded, formal business-like attire, maybe even a lab coat. This is what we conjure up when we think of a man or a woman as a scientist or a researcher. But there was once a remarkable woman, so ahead of her time that even America at the height of the sexual revolution was unable to accept the fullness of her personality, her complex work, and simple thesis. This is a review on the life and times of feminist sex researcher Shere Hite and the newly released audiobook version of a groundbreaking survey on female sexuality, the Hite Report, which was first published in book format in 1976. The 478-page Hite Report is the 30th best-selling book of all time, and the 19 hours 56 minutes audiobook is an attempt to introduce Hite's findings to a new generation, the young women and men of today. An excellent documentary on her life, The Disappearance of Shere Hite, was released 2 years ago. While watching this film made by Nicole Newnham, you'll be intrigued enough by Shere Hite to Google who the hell she is and whether she's even real, just like Variety magazine's Jessica Kiang wrote in her review of the film. Shere Hite's name is also pronounced as Shere Hite, but she called herself Shere, and I'm going with that pronunciation. It's easy to take for granted the wealth of information on anatomy and physiology of sexual behaviors and patterns that is available to us in year 2025. But a century ago, and that's not too long ago, Freud upended the field of psychology, psychiatry, and sexology by saying that the physical, biological differences between men and women influenced their psychological development. In 1925, Freud, an Austrian neurologist and MD, and father of modern therapy, announced his clinical findings in a paper titled as Some Psychical Consequences of the Anatomical Distinction Between the Sexes, a theory he expanded on in 1931 as well. In these papers, he says that a woman's neurosis can be traced to her failure to transfer her attachment as a child from her mother to her father, and from her leading genital zone clitoris to the other zone, vagina. He called clitoris analogous to male genitals as having masculine characteristics, and vagina the organ with feminine characteristics. He said little girls discover masturbation of the clitoris during hygiene-related activities and grow resentful when they are stopped. A woman, he said, recognizes the superiority of the male organ. Quote, she clings obstinately to the expectation of one day having a genital of the same kind too, and her wish for it survives long after her hope has expired. Unquote. Penis envy, he said, results in female neurosis. Freud's subjects were upper-class Viennese married female clients. Next came Dr. Alfred Kinsey, a biologist who specialized in the field of insects, entomology, gall wasps in particular, and was studying the mating behavior of gall wasps when in 1938 the Association of Women Students petitioned Indiana University, where he taught, for a course for students who were either married or were thinking of marriage. Kinsey, a professor of zoology, got asked to coordinate the course that included topics such as sexuality, reproduction, contraception, etc. Kinsey found that there wasn't much scientific data on human sexual behavior, So in 1940, he joined a fellow academic, Herman B. Wells, on a research on the subject and got funding from a committee that was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. By 1947, he founded Institute for Sex Research. In 1948, he co-wrote and published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, followed in 1953 by Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. The data and analysis and conclusions in these books were based on face-to-face, in-depth conversational interviews with subjects about their sex lives, as well as observation of sexual activity by him and his well-trained team. Everyone interviewed was a volunteer. Approximately 5,300, mostly white men, including prisoners and prostitutes, over the course of 15 years, contributed to the first book, and 5,793 white women took part in the survey for the second book. Kinsey had even encouraged his co-workers to engage in sex and filmed them. Through statistical analysis, the incidence and frequency of sexual behavior was given by noting the age, decade of birth, religious persuasion, and other factors. And the factors for the similarities as well as differences between men and women's sexual activities were investigated. Kinsey created a scale which determined where across a spectrum did a person's sexuality lie, from hetero to homo, and focused more on the biology of sex. He noted that women achieve orgasms more frequently through masturbation than vaginal intercourse, among other things. From 1957 to 1965, Dr. William Masters, a gynecologist, and his research assistant Virginia Johnson directly studied and measured physiological sexual arousal and activity in subjects by developing polygraph-like instruments and putting them on the 700 men and women who agreed to take part in this study in their laboratory. Initially, their subjects were prostitutes. Dr. Masters paired the people who were strangers to each other as couples. Their research foundation was later renamed as Masters and Johnson Institute. Their original research is most known for establishing the 4 stages of sexual response cycle. They are considered pioneers in the field of sexual dysfunction and therapy. As for women, they recognized that women had the capacity to have multiple orgasms. All of these researchers were pioneers in the field of sexology. But the 4th influence on defining and analyzing female sexuality is Shere Hite, a now forgotten flamboyant feminist whose groundbreaking research, the Hite Report, redefined women's sexual experience, putting women first and in control of their own pleasure. For centuries, women's bodies and sexual experience has been defined, regularized, and weaponized by religion, politics, and culture. Their bodies and selfhood has been used for reproduction, honor, and servitude, and this status quo includes what happens in the bedroom. This is where Hite's fierce personal opinion and findings of the survey clashed with orthodox views.
The phrase is anything to get him off.
In the documentary, there's a video of Shere Hite saying the following.
We've been adapting our bodies to male sexuality for centuries. And so I think that now what we have to do is we have to take ourselves out of that situation, see ourselves just for ourselves, and then take that knowledge and relate to other people of whatever sex, but to be doing things that are right for us. The most mysterious of organs, the female vagina, the vulva, the uterus, and especially the clitoris, names and information about these organs were suppressed for long periods in Western history. For centuries, it was said that women have difficulty having orgasm, that our orgasms are much weaker, not as real as men's. Men's orgasms are so much stronger, their sexual organs bigger, and so on. None of this is true, but for centuries, these ideas were considered unquestionable. The 20th century has seen a breakthrough in terms of women determining to gain equal rights and power in society and in private life, to own our own bodies. This includes our sexuality. In fact, sexuality, especially female sexuality, is a central key to women's freedom and status. Why? Because male ownership of women's sexuality is what makes patriarchy possible.
This passage has been taken from the video titled The Female Orgasm, posted on 11th July 2019 on the YouTube channel called Shere Hite. Originally from Missouri, in the late 1960s, she was a PhD student of social history at Columbia University, New York, where she supplemented her studies by working as a model for advertisements, paperback book covers, and appeared in Robert McGuinness's famous illustrated Bond artwork as both the girls next to Sean Connery in Diamonds Are Forever, and posed nude for Playboy magazine. With strawberry blonde hair, made-up face with a 40s Hollywood avatar, and raspy, breathy voice, she didn't fit the mold of a typical researcher. She wore glasses all right, but there was nothing conventional about her. We find out in the documentary that she dropped her doctoral program and without any funding or backing, began making and printing a questionnaire in a printing press that published anti-war material in the daytime and had given her permission to use the equipment at night. The printing press workers taught her how to use the machine, and off she went. She brought her own ink, a pale red, the shade of her nail polish, and paper, lots of paper. After printing, she distributed the questionnaire by hand with a friend on a motorbike in various New York City boroughs like the Bronx, Brooklyn, etc. She mailed the questionnaire to women's magazines and women's institutes around the country. Of the 100,000 questionnaires distributed, she heard back from 3,000 girls and women, ranging in ages from 14 to 78. In random sampling, the number of respondents is always low, and 3,000 feels like a good fat number to tabulate data on. Since she had a background in statistics, she had done her master's thesis on methodology of the social sciences, she went to work. She deciphered the free-flowing answers women had and gave statistical reality to them, as given in Chapter 9 of the audiobook. All of this took 4 years. So to me, she's a social scientist. The 2024 audiobook version of the Hite Report has been published by Post-Hypnotic Press under CEO and publisher Carlyn Craig's guidance.
Introduction to the audiobook. Hi, this is Carlyn Craig at Post-Hypnotic Press, and I wanted to say a few words.
I'm sharing it here.
Our hope is that by making it available in audio, we will extend its reach, especially to young women and men who, for whatever reason, find it hard to access in print. Once we had decided to produce the Hite Report, the next question was how? Hite received over 3,000 responses to her questionnaires from across America and beyond. Approximately 2/3 of the Hite Report is made up of the women's responses, taken directly from the questionnaires. Hite wanted the reader to appreciate the multitude of voices represented in her research, and we wanted the listener to hear that. Our talented cast was encouraged to use as many character voices as they felt inspired to create. Note that we have no information about any of the women who responded, as they are quoted anonymously. For those interested, demographic information, along with questionnaires 1, 2, and 3, can be found in the supplemental PDF that accompanies this audiobook. We dedicate this audiobook edition to Shere Hite herself. And to the women whose often secretly written responses advance the struggle to open minds and change attitudes about the sexuality of half of the world, taking another step towards our freedom and independence and improving the quality of our lives. We are forever grateful. Carlyn Craig, Publisher, Post-Hypnotic Press.
It has a narrator, Karissa Vacker, to voice Shere Hite throughout the book. I'm sharing it here, where she lays out her reasons for the research as she did in the paperback in 1976, hoping that it will not run into a copyright strike.
Preface. Women have never been asked how they felt about sex. Researchers looking for statistical norms have asked all the wrong questions for all the wrong reasons, and all too often wound up telling women how they should feel rather than asking them how they do feel. Female sexuality has been seen essentially as a response to male sexuality and intercourse. There has rarely been any acknowledgement that female sexuality might have a complex nature of its own, which would be more than just the logical counterpart of what we think of as male sexuality. What these questionnaires have attempted to do is to ask women themselves how they feel, what they like, and what they think of sex. This is not to imply that the only thing that stands between a woman and satisfactory sex is her realization of her own physical needs. Sex, as we define it, is part of the whole cultural picture. A woman's place in sex mirrors her place in the rest of society. This book presents what the women who answered said, in their own words and in their own way. The intention is to get acquainted, to share how we have experienced our sexuality, how we feel about it, and to see our personal lives more clearly, thus redefining our sexuality and strengthening our identities as women. Shere Hite, February 1976.
What follows in the Hite Report is a deep dive into each of the 3,000 women's views and complaints on masturbation, orgasm, intercourse, clitoral stimulation, lesbianism, sexual slavery, and sexual revolution. It has a chapter on older women, and Hite redefines sex beyond reproductive function and men's desires. The survey style, anonymously giving your basic demographic details and writing your answers, using your own words at your own leisure in the comfort and secrecy of your chosen environment, and then having the choice to mail it, allowed women's thoughts and feelings to enter the statistical and scientific landscape of sexology. I thought this was a huge accomplishment. The original questionnaire is included in the audiobook, and the reader can use it to become more self-aware. As we learn in the documentary, the report changed Hite's fortunes. She moved from a cockroach-infested small basement lodging to a suite in Hotel Alden, and then bought a first-floor apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City, filling the place with decorative art and assistants as she continued her research, this time focusing on male sexual experience. Meanwhile, she lived her life as a bisexual celebrity and sexual commentator. There's a talk show clip that I'm going to share over here, hoping that it will not run into a copyright strike. It is from ABC's Good Night America, episode number 28, that aired on 3rd March 1977. Good Night America was a late-night news magazine that Geraldo Rivera produced and hosted.
ABC presents Thursday Night Special.
Good night, America, how are you? Said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done.
Hello, I'm Geraldo Rivera. Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Good Night America. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about female sexuality. It's a wide-ranging and I think universally important subject that we'll attempt to cover with frank and hopefully useful discussion.
There was an informative discussion on Shere Hite's report, featuring her as a guest, as well as Dr. Mary Calderone, a pioneer sex educator, Dr. Leah Schaeffer, psychotherapist and author, and feminists Kate Millett and Norma Swenson. This episode can be viewed and downloaded on Geraldo Rivera's website. The quotes that I'm sharing over here are by Dr. Mary Calderone, followed by the views of Dr. Leah Schaeffer for what this book meant for the women in the 70s and its impact.
Doctors, welcome. Dr. Calderone, let me ask you first, a kind of general question. What do you think of the Hite report?
It's great.
Why?
It gave all sorts of women tremendous scope to say what's been in their hearts bottled up for centuries.
Tell me more about that. Why has it been so repressed, and what was the revolutionary aspect of what they had to say?
Well, for the first time, they, in a sense, were invited to think about something that they put out of their minds. If they're unhappy, or if they're unsuccessful, or if they can't orgasm, and they fake it for their husbands, that, in essence, the society says you're a failure. The husband says you're a failure. And all of a sudden came this opportunity to spend any unlimited amount of time saying the things that they felt. And believe me, it's pretty devastating what women feel. Leah Schaeffer is a psychotherapist and sex counselor. I'm not. And so she can tell you more about how devastating it is.
I think that the book gives you different ways of looking at things, and I think that it frees people of a tremendous burden. It frees people of thinking that, for instance, in the findings in the book, which have to do with the fact that 70% of the women do not experience orgasm during intercourse. Now, this does not mean that the women don't enjoy intercourse. It just means that they don't orgasm during intercourse and that they have other ways of experiencing orgasm. Now, the fact that of this finding frees a lot of women who had always felt that there was something wrong with them, that if they didn't experience sex and orgasm in the way that was considered to be the absolute perfect and best, they felt like there was something wrong with them, which put a tremendous burden on the women. Put a tremendous burden on the men, too, that they all felt like they had to accomplish something. I think the book also frees women to be responsible for their own sexual pleasure. And I think, in a way, that sometimes people tend to take that incorrectly when they think that if women are encouraged to stimulate themselves, that it means that they won't want to have sexual relations with men or whatever partners they choose. And that isn't true. All it does is it's another way of experiencing themselves, and it's also a way of finding out about themselves.
Nicole Newnham's documentary, The Disappearance of Shere Hite, contains this serious revelatory discussion on Geraldo Rivera's talk show, but it also contains examples of negative reporting that was done on Shere Hite in the press and on TV. In fact, there are clips of many interviews where the host and fellow guests are childish, undignified, or downright rude to Hite and offensive and aggressive on the topic. Even in press conferences, it is obvious that reporters didn't know what to ask her or make of her or of the topic and her place in it. There was even an attempt to turn her into a punchline, a subject of derision and mocking, when Marty Povich invited the cab driver she had a fracas with on his show with her as a guest. That kind of thing is just not done. Would the women of The View or the men of Flagrant invite some Uber driver to put a guest down? Shere Hite Research Foundation site contains links to the YouTube videos of her interviews and recordings, but snippets of the Oprah Winfrey show where Hite faced an entire audience full of angry men, young and old of all colors, is something you'll have to see in the documentary, because that content is not available on YouTube. Everything about that book and about Shere Hite is a trigger for the male audience, and it's weird that something that is supposed to bring two people closer was interpreted as alienation, separation, and disenfranchisement of men from women's sexual lives. I think it all came down to the fact that Hite just didn't look the part of what society has been conditioned to expect in a serious researcher or a serious woman. A serious thinker cannot be saucy, alive, and vulnerable at the same time. By contrast, Shere Hite was a colorful, vibrant, smiling researcher, embracing her feminine self while having an argument over equality in the sexual experience for both men and women. She also had the mental wherewithal to put her ideas in political and historical context. She produced a best-selling survey report and was an exacting, demanding individual. America was not ready for such an intellectual. America was not ready for a woman as a well-rounded human being. I love this line from Jessica Kiang's review of the documentary published on the Variety magazine site on 26 Jan 2023. Quote, "In reclaiming Hite from obscurity, the film takes its cue from a subject who saw no contradiction between intellectual political seriousness and a playful love of beauty and flamboyance in everything from home decor to dress style." Unquote. And in the documentary, Iris Brosch, the photographer who took Hite's pictures, says, quote, "You never see a portrait of an intelligent woman with an intelligent face and at the same time a vulva, a woman complete with sexuality."
An icon of woman complete means with sexuality.
Unquote. Hite weathered the increasing criticism on her methodology and findings. The random sampling was a snafu for critics, as was her inability to gather demographic info on some of the respondents, even though they were of diverse backgrounds and races. Plus, I feel she could have positioned the statistical part of her analysis a bit differently, maybe. For example, Nancy Friday's My Secret Garden, Women's Sexual Fantasies was published by Trident Press US in 1973. It was probably the first book of its kind. Another one of her books, Men in Love, was published by Hutchinson UK in 1980, and Women on Top by Random House in 1992. All contained interviews or feedback from anonymous contributors who explained in long-form narration their real-life experiences and erotic fantasies. Nancy Friday was quick to say that these books were not scientific reports. In Hite's case, because she insisted on the statistical foundation of her study, her critics fought with her on her findings on the basis of proportion of samples surveyed and her statistical analysis. Maybe if she had just said the report speaks for itself, just like any other work in development, the critics wouldn't have attacked her the way they did. Or maybe they still would have. Despite being a bisexual, Hite was married twice, both times to men. First to pianist Friedrich Horek, with whom she lived in her Fifth Avenue flat and later on in Cologne, Germany. She also lived in France for a while. Paul Sullivan was her second husband. They lived in Tottenham, North London. Despite the marriages, she maintained intimate relations and contact with female friends. In her later years, she developed corticobasal degeneration, a rare neurological disorder, and died in September 2020. I think she was a fascinating woman with a remarkable sense of style, who lived a full life and enrich the world's understanding on female sexuality. Before calling time on this review, I'd like to mention a woman from a century ago. Long before Shere Hite gave women's sexual feelings a space, a voice, and a platform, Dr. Clelia Mosher, an assistant professor of personal hygiene at Stanford in 1910, did just about the same by getting responses on a 9-page sex questionnaire titled Marital Relation from 45 Married Victorian Women between 1892 to 1920, almost 3 decades. The survey had open-ended questions aimed at drawing out feelings and experiences. She entitled the responses as The Statistical Study of the Marriage of 47 Women, but she never completed it, never made any observations on the data, nor did she publish it. It wasn't until 1974, when the Mosher Report was introduced in Carl Degler's article for the American Historical Review, that her work posthumously came to light. And what did her report say? That majority of those surveyed 45 women from the prudish Victorian times enjoyed sex, had orgasm, and believed enjoyment of both sexes as reason to have intercourse. They were also worried about unplanned pregnancies. Dr. Clelia Mosher's effort is probably a precursor to Hite's emphasis on equality between men and women's right in deriving equal pleasure from sex. But as Cara Platoni writes in the March-April 2010 edition of Stanford magazine, quote, ultimately Mosher's story is deeply ironic. She was a staunch feminist who remained aloof from sisterhood, a woman who rigorously researched sexuality and marriage, yet probably experienced neither, a pioneering scholar who longed for recognition but did not live to enjoy it. Today there is an often well-rewarded place in our society for awkward overachievers, but Mosher struggled her entire life with her ungainly intellect and with being a woman in a man's research world. Unquote. For those living in year 2025 who want to read the Mosher Report, they can check Catherine Elamong Jacobs' article for American Heritage magazine, the June-July 1981 edition, volume 32, issue 4, as given under americanheritage.com/Mosher-report. I will encourage girls and women listening or watching right now to have a look at the Hite Report audiobook and the documentary The Disappearance of Shere Hite. Consider them the safe space in which frank opinion and complaints of anonymous women can reassure you that there's nothing shameful about aspiring to be sexually satisfied, and that none of it is a dirty word.